Chapter 8, of Unfitting Dejection, and when it is excessive. And what is the right temper of the soul herein? Question 1. Then, how shall we know when a man is cast down and disquieted, otherwise than is befitting? Answer. There is a threefold miscarriage of inward trouble. 1. When the soul is troubled for that it should not be vexed for, as Ahab, when he was crossed in his will for Naboth's vineyard, 1 Kings 21:1, 2, and the later verses. 2. In the ground, as when we grieve for that which is good, and for that which we should grieve for, but it is with too much reflecting upon our own particular. As in the troubles of the state or church, we ought to be affected, but not because these troubles hinder any liberties of the flesh, and restrain pride of life, but from higher respects, as that, by these troubles God is dishonored, the public exercises of religion hindered, and the gathering of souls thereby stopped, as the states and commonwealths, which should be harbors of the church, are disturbed, as lawless courses and persons prevail, as religion and justice are triumphed over and trodden under. Men usually are grieved for public miseries from a spirit of self-love only, because their own private is embarked in the public. There is a depth of deceit of the heart in this matter. 3. So for the measure, when we trouble ourselves, though not without cause, yet without bounds. The spirit of man is like unto moist elements, as air and water, which have no bounds of their own to contain them in, but those of the vessel that keeps them. Water is spilt and lost without something to hold it, so it is with the spirit of man, unless it be bounded with the Spirit of God. Put the case, a man be disquieted for sin, for which not to be disquieted is a sin, yet we may look too much, and too long upon it, for the soul hath a double eye, one to look to sin, another to look up to God's mercy in Christ. Having two objects to look on, we may sin in looking too much on the one, with neglect of the other. Question 2. Seeing then, disquieting and dejection for sin is necessary, how shall we know when it exceeds measure? Answer 1. First, when it hinders us from holy duties, or in the performance of them, by distraction or otherwise, whereas they are given to carry us to that which is pleasing to God, and good to ourselves. Grief is ill when it taketh off the soul from minding that it should, and so indisposes us to the duties of our callings. Christ upon the cross was grieved to the utmost, yet it did not take away his care for his mother, John 19:26 and 27, so the good thief, Luke 23:42, in the midst of his pangs labored to gain his fellow, and to save his own soul, and to glorify Christ. If this be so in grief of body, which taketh away the free use of reason and exercise of grace more than any other grief, then much more in grief from more remote causes, for in extremity of body the sickness may be such as all that we can perform to God is a quiet submission and a desire to be carried unto Christ by the prayers of others, we should so mind our grief as not to forget God's mercy, or our own duty. 2. Secondly, when we forget the grounds of comfort, and suffer our mind to run only upon the present grievance. It is a sin to dwell on sin and turmoil our thoughts about it, when we are called to thankfulness. A physician in good discretion forbids a dish at some times to prevent the nourishment of some disease, which another time he gives way unto. So we may and ought to abstain from too much feeding our thoughts upon our corruptions in case of discouragement, which at other times is very necessary. It should be our wisdom in such cases to change the object, and labor to take off our minds, and give them to that which calls more for them. Grief oft passes unseasonably upon us, when there is cause of joy, and when we are called to joy, as Job justly found fault with David for grieving too much, when God had given him the victory, and rid him and the state of a traitorous son, 2 Samuel 19:5, and later verses. God hath made some days for joy, and joy is the proper work of those days. This is the day which the Lord hath made, Psalm 118:24. Some in a sick distemper desire that which increases their sickness, so some that are deeply cast down, desire a weakening ministry, and whatever may cast them down more, whereas they should meditate upon comforts, and get some sweet assurance of God's love. Joy is the constant temper which the soul should be in. Rejoice evermore, 1 Thessalonians 5:16, says the Apostle. If a sink be stirred, we stir it not more, but go into a sweeter room. So we should think of that which is comfortable, and of such truths as may raise up the soul, and sweeten the spirit. 3. Thirdly, grief is too much, when it inclines the soul to any inconvenient courses, for if it be not looked to, it is an ill counsellor, when either it hurts the health of our bodies, or draws the soul, for to ease itself, to some unlawful liberty. When grief keeps such a noise in the soul, that it will not hear what the messengers of God, or the still voice of the Spirit says. As is combustions, loud cries are scarce heard, so in such cases the soul will neither hear itself nor others. The fruit of this overmuch trouble of spirit is increase of trouble. Question 3. Another question may be, what that sweet and holy temper is the soul should be in, that it may neither be faulty in the defect, nor too much abound in grief and sorrow? Answer 1. The soul must be raised to a right grief. 2. The grief that is raised, though it be right, yet it must be bounded. Before we speak of raising grief in the godly, we must know there are some who are altogether strangers to any kind of spiritual grief or trouble at all. Such must consider that the way to prevent everlasting trouble is to desire to be troubled with a preventing trouble. Let those that are not in the way of grace think with themselves what cause they have not to take a minute's rest while they are in that estate. For a man to be in debt both body and soul, subject every minute to be arrested and carried prisoner to hell, and not to be moved, for a man to have the wrath of God ready to be poured out upon him, and hell gape for him, nay, to carry a hell about him in conscience, if it were awake. And to have all his comfort here hanging upon a weak thread of this life, ready to be cut and broken off every moment, and to be cursed in all those blessings that he enjoys, and yet not to be disquieted, but continually treasuring up wrath against the day of wrath. By running deeper into God's books, for a man to be thus, and not to be disquieted, is but the devil's peace, whilst the strong man holds possession. A burning ague is more hopeful than a lethargy. The best service that can be done to such men is to startle and rouse them, and so with violence to pull them out of the fire, as Jude speaks, verse 23, or else they will another day curse that cruel mercy that lets them alone now. In all their jollity in this world, they are but as a book fairly bound, which when it is opened is full of nothing but tragedies. So when the book of their consciences shall be once opened, there is nothing to be read but lamentations and woes. Such men were in a way of hope, if they had but so much apprehension of their estates, as to ask themselves, what have I done? If this be true that there are such fearful things prepared for sinners, why am I not cast down? Why am I no more troubled and discouraged for my wicked courses? Despair to such is the beginning of comfort, and trouble the beginning of peace. A storm is the way to a calm, and hell the way to heaven. 1. But for raising of a right grief in the soul of a holy man, look what is the state of the soul in itself, in what terms it is with God, whether there be any sin hanging on the file, be unrepented of. If all be not well within us, then here is place for inward trouble, whereby the soul may afflict itself. God saw this grief so needful for his people, that he appointed certain days for afflicting them, Leviticus 16:29, because it is fit that sin contracted by joy should be dissolved by grief, and sin is so deeply invested into the soul, that a separation betwixt the soul and it cannot be wrought without much grief. When the soul hath smarted for sin, it sets then the right price upon reconciliation with God in Christ, and it feels what a bitter thing sin is, and therefore it will be afraid to be too bold with it afterward. It likewise awes the heart so. That it will not be so loose towards God as it was before, and certainly that soul that hath felt the sweetness of keeping peace with God, cannot but take deeply to heart, that there should be anything in us that should divide betwixt us and the fountain of our comfort. That should stop the passage of our prayers and the current of God's favors both towards ourselves and others. It is such an ill as is the cause of all other ill, and damps all our comforts. 2. We should look out of ourselves also, considering whether for troubles at home and abroad, God calls not to mourning or troubling of ourselves. Grief of compassion is as well required as grief of contrition. It is a dead member that is not sensible of the state of the body. Jeremiah, for fear he should not weep enough for the distressed state of the church, desired of God, that his eyes might be made a fountain of tears. Jeremiah 9:1. A Christian, as he must not be proud flesh, so neither must he be dead flesh, none more truly sensible either of sin or of misery. So far as misery carries with it any sign of God's displeasure, than a true Christian, which issues from the life of grace, which, where it is in any measure, is lively, and therefore sensible, for God gives motion and senses for the preservation of life. As God's bowels are tender towards us, so God's people have tender bowels towards him, his cause, his people, and his church. The fruit of this sensibleness is earnest prayer to God. As Melanchthon said well, if I cared for nothing, I would pray for nothing. Grief being thus raised, must, as we said before, be bounded and guided. 1. God hath framed the soul, and planted such affections in it, as may answer all his dealing towards his children, that when he enlarges himself towards them, then the soul should enlarge itself to him again, when he opens his hand. We ought to open our hearts. When he shows any token of displeasure, we should grieve. When he troubles us, we should trouble and grieve ourselves. As God any way discovers himself, so the soul should be in a suitable pliableness. Then the soul is as it should be, when it is ready to meet God at every turn, to joy when he calls for it, to mourn when he calls for that, to labor to know God's meaning in everything. 2. Again, God hath made the soul for a communion with himself, which communion is especially placed in the affections, which are the springs of all spiritual worship. Then the affections are well ordered, when we are fit to have communion with God, to love, joy, trust, to delight in him above all things. The affections are the inward movings of the soul, which then move best when they move us to God, not from him. They are the feet of the soul, whereby we walk with, and before God. When we have our affections at such command, that we can take them off from anything in the world, at such times as we are to have more near communion with God in hearing or prayer, and see, as Abraham when he was to sacrifice left whatsoever might hinder him at the bottom of the mount. Genesis 22:5. When we let our affections so far into the things of the world, as we cannot take them off when we are to deal with God, it is a sign of spiritual intemperancy. It is said of the Israelites that they brought Egypt with them into the wilderness, so many bring the world into their hearts with them when they come before God. 3. But because our affections are never well ordered without judgment, as being to follow, not to lead, it is an evidence that the soul is in a fit temper, when there is such a harmony in it, as that we judge of things as they are, and affect as we judge, and execute as we affect. This harmony within breeds uniformity and constancy in our resolutions, so that there is, as it were, an even thread drawn through the whole course and tenor of our lives, when we are not off and on, up and down. It argues an ill state of body when it is very hot, or very cold, or hot in one part, and cold in another, so unevenness of spirit argues a distemper. A wise man's life is of one color, like itself. The soul bred from heaven, so far as it is heavenly minded, desires to be, like heaven, above all storms, uniform, constant, not as things under the sun, which are always in changes, constant only in inconstancy. Affections are as it were the wind of the soul, and then the soul is carried as it should be, when it is neither so becalmed that it moves not when it should, nor yet tossed with tempests to move disorderly, when it is so well balanced that it is neither lift up nor cast down too much, but keeps a steady course. Our affections must not rise to become unruly passions, for then as a river that overflows the banks, they carry much slime and soil with them. Though affections be the wind of the soul, yet unruly passions are the storms of the soul, and will overturn all, if they be not suppressed. The best, as we see in David here, if they do not steer their hearts aright, are in danger of sudden gusts. A Christian must neither be a dead sea, nor a raging sea. 4. Our affections are then in best temper, when they become so many graces of the Spirit, as when love is turned to a love of God, joy, to a delight in the best things, fear, to a fear of offending Him more than any creature, sorrow, to a sorrow for sin, etc. 5. They are likewise in good temper, when they move us to all duties of love and mercy towards others, when they are not shut where they should be open, nor open where they should be shut. Yet there is one case where exceeding affection is not over-exceeding, as in an ecstasy of zeal upon a sudden apprehension of God's dishonor, and His cause trodden under foot. It is better in this case, rather scarce to be our own men, than to be calm or quiet. It is said of Christ and David, that their hearts were eaten up with a holy zeal for God's house, Psalm 69:9 and 119:139, Isaiah 59:19. In such a case, Moses, unparalleled for meekness, was turned into a holy rage, Exodus 32:19. The greatness of the provocation, the excellency of the object, and the weight of the occasion, bears out the soul, not only without blame, but with great praise, in such seeming distempers. It is the glory of a Christian to be carried with full sail, and as it were with a springtide of affection. So long as the stream of affection runs in the due channel, and if there be great occasions for great motions, then it is fit the affections should rise higher, as to burn with zeal, to be sick of love, Song of Songs 2:5, to be more vile for the Lord, as David, 2 Samuel 6:22. To be counted out of our wits, 2 Corinthians 5:13, with St. Paul, to further the cause of Christ and the good of souls. Thus we may see the life of a poor Christian in this world. 1. He is in great danger, if he be not troubled at all. 2. When he is troubled, he is in danger to be over-troubled. 3. When he hath brought his soul in tune again, he is subject to new troubles. Betwixt this ebbing and flowing there is very little quiet. Now because this cannot be done without a great measure of God's Spirit, our help is to make use of that promise of giving the Holy Ghost to them that ask it, John 11:13. To teach us when, how long, and how much to grieve, and when, and how long, and how much to rejoice, the Spirit must teach the heart this, who as He moved upon the waters before the creation, so He must move upon the waters of our souls, for we have not the command of our own hearts. Every natural man is carried away with his flesh and humours, upon which the devil rides, and carries him whither he list. He hath no better counsellors than flesh and blood, and Satan counselling with them. But a godly man is not a slave to his carnal affections, but as David here, labours to bring into captivity the first motions of sin in his heart.